team here were actually chosen as part of our Format 23 open call and exhibiting in Derby at the moment in our City Lab space in the city centre. And on show we have a book from each of the members of the network. And yeah, we're really excited about today's talk. We've had some amazing interest in the show in Derby. So I'm delighted for everyone to be able to hear more. So I'm going to hand over to Tamsin now, and she will introduce the group and do some housekeeping. But thank you.
Thank you, Niamh, and thank you to you and to Format for choosing us from the open call. It's an amazing platform to be given to talk about sustainability, which is the purpose of the network. So thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening for this event. For those of you who don't know who we are, the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network are a group of photographers, publishers, academics and writers who discuss and share knowledge on issues around environmentally conscious approaches to making books. We organise talks such as this one. We maintain a resource list of printers and papers for those of you that are based in the UK. And we also do a series of online features on individual photo books where we work with publishers, photographers and designers to uncover the challenges and lessons learned from making books, and also to uncover the materials and processes that are used to make them. And it's 23 of these case study features which are exhibited in the exhibition at Format, currently in Derby. And so we're really excited to have this evening 4 of those exhibitors with us to talk more about their work. And the discussion is going to be chaired by Eugenie Shinkle. And I will do a quick intro to Eugenie before handing over to her to moderate the discussion. So Eugenie is a photographer and writer based in London. She is the co-editor of the online photo book platform C4 Journal and is a reader in photography at Westminster University. She is also an active member of the SPP network. So I'm really grateful that she could be here this evening to chair the discussion. And we will have questions from all of you at the end. So if you want to share questions as we go in the chat box, we'll come to these at the end. The meeting is also being recorded. So if anyone doesn't want to be part of that, feel free to turn off your camera. Over to you, Eugenie.
Great. Thanks very much, Tamsin. And also thanks to Format for hosting this and to everyone who's joined us today. I'll be doing a really brief introduction to the panel and to the talk itself, and then we'll be getting right into it with some presentations by all of the members of the panel. But first, just to kind of give some context, the basis of this panel came out of a questionnaire that Tamsin circulated online on behalf of the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network back in January. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But first, let me introduce the panel, and I'm going to just do that in alphabetical order, starting with Maren Bollati. Maren is based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he's an artist, teacher, the editor of the publishing imprint SED Editiorial, and a coordinator of the Museo de la Fotografia Estrada Study Center. Now, SED, I've talked to Maren in quite a lot of detail about his imprint. It's a really interesting one with a focus on the relationship between photography and fiction. And they're also obviously very interested in the sustainable production of photo book projects. So he'll be telling us about that. Next on my list is Tiffany Jones, who is the editor of the London-based photo book label Overlapse, which she founded in 2015. She's also the author of a tiny perfect text called Dynamics of the Photo Book Market, which is a detailed look at the economics of photo book production. So she's kind of ideally positioned to speak to some of the issues that came up in the questionnaire that was circulated in January. Maren Krings. Maren moves around quite a bit, but at the moment she is based in an off-grid cabin in the Austrian Alps, and I understand there's a blizzard going on there at the moment. Maren is a climate impact storyteller and the author of 4 books, the most recent of which is titled H is for Hemp. And this was a really deep dive into sustainable bookmaking that involved a 6-year journey across 26 different countries. and the development of a specialist paper with paper manufacturers Hanemüller. So she's exploring ways in this book that this very fast growing and economical plant can be instrumental in helping us to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And finally, Rebecca Lardeur is a London-based researcher, designer, and producer with a specialist focus on climate science communications. Since 2019, she has been involved in the Climate and Cities Project, which is an initiative that explores design strategies for sustainable cities, not just from the standpoint of the city as a problem, but as a site with the potential to create imaginative and viable solutions for sustainable futures. She's also very interested in practical ways of measuring our carbon footprint, which she's very happy to talk about and will be doing so. So before the panel get into their presentations, I'll just tell you a little bit about the survey that Tamsin circulated in January. There were quite a few responses, but there were 5 questions that came up repeatedly. One was how to balance accessible book prices with sustainable production values. The second was, can making a book ever really be sustainable? The third one was a very practical question. How do I find and research sustainable options? Then there was a question that came up about the impact of geography on the availability of choices, which is one that we don't always think about. And finally, how do we evaluate sustainable choices? How do we weigh up the various options that we have? And what's really interesting as well, and I hope we'll have time to get into, is the way that these open out onto broader issues about the kind of choices we have to make as individuals and as groups of people to be sustainable more generally. So that's a kind of a broad context for the talk. I will hand over now to the panelists in alphabetical order, I guess. So that would be Martin, Tiffany, Maren, and then Rebecca. And they're each going to take about 5 minutes or so just to introduce themselves and what they do. So I guess, Martin, we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks, Eugenie, for the presentation. Hello, everyone, and thanks again, Format and Tamsin, for the invitation. I'm gonna share this presentation. Just let me know if everything is okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm based in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, as Eugenie said. My publishing house is called SED Editiorial, which translates to thirst, like having thirst, to be thirsty. So the book I brought today to present is actually 2 books which are part of the exhibition in Format. It's a couple of books which are destined to be more than 2. Right now we have these 2 published, which the origin of these books is this public archive organized by this artist in Chile. Her name is Celeste Rojas Mujica, and she built this platform, which is online and free and available, of like this vast archive of images, photographies of the social, what's the English word? The social burst in Chile, like from the last 4 or 5 years. So our idea with this archive that has like a massive amount of pictures from manifestations, etc., we proposed this idea of translating this platform, this digital archive, into a publishing platform. So we are starting to kind of a series of books investigating and using this same material. Kind of, and speaking about sustainability, a way of also doing an ecological research from the point of view of production. No? We are using always the same pictures, right? So the first book is a book that was printed in offset, part of the book, and part of the book in risography. The book comes like in this little folder with an open. It has no binding, so our idea was to build kind of like an open edition book which the viewer can alternate and build its own experience towards it. The book is an open edition exercise on iconoclasm to edition. Most of the pictures in this platform are aimed at documenting these gestures of appropriation of monumental statuary, yeah, in that sense. So this book aims to build this kind of archive of new statues, like intervened by people. In this presentation, I just realized I'm missing one slide, which stated the sustainable points of printing in risography. So I wrote them down. I'm going to read them. I'm sorry about that. I just realized. The idea of risography is that using risography in terms of sustainability, it does the inks in risography are soy inked inks, so they don't have solvent. So in that way, they are less harmful for the environment. Also, the risography system has like a less discard use of papers when setting the machine, like in comparison to bigger printing systems like offset. And also a big advantage point in using risography or digital offset, like this other system I'm gonna show you now, is that they both have a usage of 100% of the ink. They have no discard in the ink usage, like offset does. So this is the second book. I'm gonna go quick because I don't wanna take like a lot of time of the presentation. But the second book, the first book is kind of, it focuses on filling the space, filling the public space with manifestation. And the second book, it's quite the opposite. It's about the empty space. So it's set in the same space where the revolution took place, this monument. And you know, there's a moment in during the Chilean burst that the government decided to take out the statue and they left the empty space. So this book addresses the occupation of the empty space versus the occupation of the field place. So the book is an open edition exercise on iconoclasm through subtraction, like the opposite of the second book. And as I said before, this project aims to be developing more books using the same archive, kind of. I think I'm going to stop sharing. I'm not sure how much time it took, but
you took, I think, almost exactly 5 minutes. So thank you.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so if you stop sharing, I think we'll hand it over to Tiffany now. Tiffany, are you there?
Hi there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for the introduction, Eugenie. I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit further. I was born in Canada, and there I studied photojournalism. I wanted to be a photographer, but I continued on to study publishing, and I wrote my dissertation, The Dynamics of the Photo Books Market, which was done here at Oxford Brookes University. I've been in London for 17 years, and as part of my master's program, I decided I wanted to consider starting a publishing imprint. And so Overlapse Photobooks was born with a book I published while I was doing my master's. So I just wanted to talk a bit about what Overlapse Books' kind of mission is. I publish visual literature from a range of international voices, subjects and stories that address social, cultural, and environmental issues, all themes connected to human experience, covetable and collectible objects. So I really want these books to be kept for a long time and passed along. They're made to be accessible and they're well priced. I focus on creating books with a sensory and experience-led engaging design and using tactile papers and often recycled papers. But I also focus on premium print and production standards with tight quality control. And like I said, the books are made to last, hopefully for hundreds of years until they fall apart. And I like to work with making small and portable books, which connect back to the idea of being visual literature. And they're made to be shared. So a lot of the editions are, I'll talk a little bit more about how many I print, but I'll just carry on to the next. So I work really closely acting as a bridge between the photographers and the audience and trying to get their mission across to communicate what their message is. So I build the books in collaboration with photographers and using a range of source materials, using archival images, illustrations, new images and text, and enhancing the storytelling and the core intentions of the work are my goals with working with a photographer. And the book object, in the end, should also always communicate the spirit of the content that is within the book. So that's really important to me. And the the projects that I work on involve a lot of environmental themes. So I do look for papers that are environmentally sound to use. Now, I'm just going to show a couple of books that are in the exhibition in Derby at Format Festival. Fastidiosa is a project by Cami and Puccini, who are two Italian photographers who focused on photographing the decimation of olive trees in the south of Italy. They've been infected by a plant epidemic, which is spread by insects. And they inject the tree with kind of a bacteria that kills the trees from the inside out. So we made this book using 5 different papers that are from a mill in Italy. So it's representative of the work in sort of format and function, and also the papers are from that place. The other book that we have in the exhibition in Derby is Beyond Drifting: Imperfectly Known Animals by Mandy Barker. This book, Mandy Barker focuses on photographing plastic pollution in the world's oceans, and she's been doing that for almost 15 years now. That's her sole project. And this book, we wanted to make, Mandy came with an idea that she wanted to make a book that looked like it was made before plastic existed. And the idea is that she takes these photographs of plastic objects and moves them while she's photographing them. So they're a time lapse. And the images end up looking like plankton or the new animals of the sea. And so as you come to the back of the book, this 4th picture on the bottom right, it shows what what the animals are. So you could see there's like a 6-pack drink yolk and some plastic pieces that she collected. So this book was really my first foray into trying to work with environmental issues. And Mandy's project was really quite a huge success. We printed 750 copies of this book, and we hand sanded every corner of every page of the book. It's printed using soy-based inks, and it wasn't wrapped in any plastic for distribution. So it looks like an old book, and it's quite nice because if it gets damaged, it still looks like an old book. And these are some more pages from inside. On the far left, you can see the cover of the book under the dust jacket. And on the right, you can see that the back section was concealed, and you had to actually open the tape to reveal the pages that show that they're plastic objects. We also worked on an artist edition together, and Mandy handmade all the pieces that were contained, like the prints, the envelopes. This is a specimen slide showing plastics that she little microplastic beads that she collected off the shore. And on the right, oh, sorry, is that it?
You're just on 5 minutes, yeah. this.
Okay, I'll just wrap it up with, I'm just going to show one more picture of Mandy's work, which is, we sold out of her book and we printed a miniature edition of her book, which is just singer sewn down the middle. Okay, thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Tiffany. Next up, I think we have Maren. You ready?
Yes, I am. Let me share my screen. Whoopala. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to. Here we go. Can you see it full screen?
Oh.
Everybody hears me? Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, Eugenie, for the kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Now I'm going to be talking about this hemp book. It's a book that definitely concerns the topic of hemp, but was also printed, as Eugenie already told. And that was actually quite a journey to get that paper made, because I could not find any sustainable paper when I had already declared that I was going to print on hemp. So just to frame a little bit that whole big topic of hemp, as you can see, the book is kind of like in an encyclopedia format. So, you know, besides the paper topic, there's all of these topics that hemp can cover, which is building industry. It's actually a carbon negative building material. Hemp can be used for phytoremediation, which means pulling toxins from the ground. In the case of hemp, this is heavy metals and also nuclear pollution from our industries. Now, if you do that with hemp, please do not use it for food. If you actually grow the plant in clean soils, then it's a superfood. It's got a lot of proteins and omegas. It's used for textiles, as it is the strongest and also longest plant fiber we have in the world. The tree-free I will keep because I will continue on that topic. And also it's used for biocomposites, meaning, you know, you can make skis just as well as the car or automotive industry has been using hemp composites over decades, actually. They've just never talked about it because they didn't want to explain people that they're not going to be high when they're driving a car that is outfitted with a hemp panel. So this is the little framing, and let's continue on the topic of paper, which I really enjoyed listening to my, how do you say, previous presenters, because they actually summarized a bunch of the things that were also part of my book. You know, looking for a different printing method than offset was one of the ways to really save on paper. Using, well, the ink, I was doing it on inkjet, which is probably not the most sustainable, but the hemp paper is actually known to be a very archival, long-lasting paper. Our first documents that have been preserved for centuries are actually all printed on hemp paper. And here's the big misery. When we're looking at this image, we're seeing a Nordic boreal forest, which is actually over 600 years old. When I say over 600 years, it's one of these things that we tend to misunderstand in our modern world, that most of the trees that we see nowadays are actually plantation trees that are non-native species, that are actually sometimes even invasive species when they're planted somewhere else. And the fast-moving paper industry is certainly something that doesn't preserve these old forests. And as a climate impact storyteller, I do want to take you on to my story that inspired me to actually develop the hemp paper, which happened in a very short period while living with the Sami indigenous people in Scandinavia. And when I saw and realized and understood that their reindeer, which is their livelihood, are actually feeding the entire Arctic winter off one single sort of lichen that's growing in only forest stands that are over 600 years old. And that kind of made me think that, you know, how much of a bad impact will I have on my good friends now, that, you know, a 624-page book will actually leave quite an impact of a footprint on, you know, paper. And I do want to show you this illustration, which shows Finland. And no, I do not want to bash on Finland. It's just one example of what's happening all over Europe. And in fact, unfortunately, also all over the world. Finland was pretty much deforested within 100 years, which is, you know, as said, this is happening in many, many other countries as well. And one of the reasons is that, with the turn to the industrial century, or the machine-driven century, we started turning from hemp fibers for paper into tree origins. And if you look at the chart, you see that 63% of all our papers nowadays are actually tree-based. Only 34% of that can be recycled, because the tree fiber is much weaker than hemp fiber is, and therefore it has less recycling runs that we can do. If you look at the very bottom, if you can see it on your computer screens, you see that there's only 3% of non-wood origin, and this also includes hemp, which, in fact, we should just invert this chart and make sure that we're actually supplying our paper industries with something that's an agricultural fiber that is regrowing annually, which hemp is, and which in the case of hemp, it actually produces 4 times more fiber than we can gain from the trees. It has less lignin, so that we need to use less of the paper, of the chemicals to get the lignin out of the fibers in order to produce the paper. So this is just, some of the facts that are coming along with, when we as artists, we're also quite heavy on the paper use, and Tiffany summarized that really well, that paper is something so important. We like the hapticity of it. We like the tactile properties of paper. And one of the things that I felt really compelled to was actually when we finally had that end product of the hemp paper. It touches like a very smooth, it's almost like a felty touch that you get from this book. We left the book completely uncoated, which of course, the printer, the paper producer, everyone was like, are you insane? This is not going to fly. This is a really expensive book and people are going to scratch it. And I said, nope, we're just going to have to go down that way, because we can't claim to make anything more sustainable if we just continue using the same applications and the same ways of producing it. So this book is also delivered without any plastic wrapping. Mind you, we have a huge disclaimer on the back that basically tells you, please be careful. Use a book as a book should be used. It's a long-lasting object, but only if you use it with care. And I think this is also something we should remember when we're using books nowadays, because we've gotten so used to the classic coffee table photography book that has a big coating of plastic on it, where, if you spill something on it, you just swipe it off and it's okay. But this is also a bit of this, little appreciation for an art form. So yes, here's another couple install. I'm actually almost done. This is a couple of install shots, and if you want to find out a little bit more on this whole journey and everything, then please head over to the website. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maren. Everybody's doing a really brilliant job of keeping to time, because there's a lot to discuss, and I've got a whole half page of questions already. I'm going to end by handing it over to Rebecca. Are you there? Yes, she is.
Hi.
Hello.
How I've lost you.
No,
So can you see my screen all well?
Yep.
Right. Thank you so much. So our book is a little white book that is here. It's called Creative Climate Investigations. And it is realized by a collective. We're called Climate and Cities. And we use research and creativity to try and create new narrative about how to live in the urban environment in a changed climate. Look, more information on the website. Let's go into it. So that's our little book, which was 3 years of work into one little book, which I'm sure a lot of you feel that feeling. And just to recap on the content of the book, inside is the result of 8 young creative of like 25, 30 years old who each pick a topic that they were close to. And then as a collective, we did individual research projects where we wanted to look at a project holistically to then end up doing a proposition. So that's what the book is. It is 8 research projects into sound pollution, green allotments, air quality, the Olympics, trees, data centers, plastics, and it came to the point that we were like, okay, well, we've got all of that research and now we need to put it in a book. But because the research was so much about climate, it became very obvious that we had to make it in a sustainable way. So how do we walk the walk after talking the talk around climate? So we are more in the design space, I think, than the art space. So our approach might be slightly different than previous one, but we know those two main concepts. The concept of carbon, that you can also call like net zero, that you will hear a lot of government use. And to speak carbon, you have to measure it. But you can also look at it like, where is fossil fuel in my making process, and how do I make sure that I do not rely on it if we are to go towards a fossil fuel free future. The other method out there around sustainability is the circular economy, and that really truly helps to reduce the pressure on biodiversity. And circular economy has 3 pillars: design out waste and pollution, make things to last, and regenerate nature. So we ended up with those 2 main principles, with those 5 under methods to apply when we're starting making, so we could really follow something that could be replicated. And we teamed up with Folium, this lovely Stuart, to help us make the book. So we find someone who was a printer that was willing to spend the time with us to test and do weird things and ask questions, and didn't mind getting their hands dirty. And we picked them because when we were looking for printers, we had the first size, and all the commercial printers was like, yes, absolutely, we'll do that for you, not a problem, we're super sustainable, here all our accreditations. And when we spoke to Harry and Stuart, one of the first things I said was like, oh, why don't you make this 0.5 centimeter less wide, and then you gain X amount of paper? And we were like, okay, we're going with those people because they'll ask us, they'll help us to find the right questions. And I'm personally a big fan of questions. So I just wanted to share a little bit as to how we measured carbon. It is something that, like, when you measure carbon, it's a very simple equation in your head. It is an activity metric, so kilometers traveled or kilos of material used or something similar, that you just multiply by a carbon conversion factors that does give you a carbon footprint. This is an average. It's called a carbon calculation. If you're a scientist and you're actually measuring something very precise on a specific case that you'd expect someone in a white robe to do, that's called a measurement, a carbon measurement. What we did is a carbon calculation. We've put 2 of those resources are free and open source. Most paid for software uses those. On the left, it's the UK government website, which is very good for energy and transport and travel. And on the right is a 2030 calculator, who has a lot of materials on there. It's a free software to browse, and it's from it's made in Sweden. I really like it. And so when we measured our footprint for the book, I wish we had measured the before and after. That's already with all the work we had done. And I'm very happy to say we've estimated it at like 1 kilo of carbon per book, which is like quite good. I think the number you get out there from like the Penguin books or the folio books is like 3 kilos per book. So we've done a third of it. So it's doable to reduce, which is what we need. The flight and the travel were like quite surprising for us, because we had done a lot of efforts. In terms of travel, we only travel with the public transport of London. We didn't take the cab, but it still ended up being almost like more than a third. No, more a bit less than a quarter, sorry. But that does prove how little our carbon footprint was. And freight, we printed everything in-house with Folium to avoid printing a cover there and this there and the photo there. So it was all done in one place. But the paper did come from Austria. But it came in a truck and we did find the UK things. But I think what we're trying to say here is like taking that scientific approach of measuring to understand where to prioritize is extremely helpful, to make sure that you do something, and even if it's not precise, it will be accurate enough for you to do this. And then I think I'm out of time, right? So here's the material used per weight, which I won't get into, but I can come back to it if there's questions. And I will just stop speaking, and there's lots on the website that explains this process. So I'll share that. So if you have questions, I want to make sure there's enough time for the question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We're doing really well, actually, in terms of keeping to time. And I wanted to just pick up on something you said about priorities, which is a really interesting one and a really good way to open up the panel discussion. And that is, how do we balance accessible book prices, which I know is really important. Tiffany, you mentioned that specifically, with sustainable production values. And I think the way we'll work the panel is that I will pose a question to an individual and then we can just open it up. And I hope we'll be able to cover all 5 of the questions and it will kind of flow organically. But I wondered if, Tiffany, you wanted to kind of start with that question of priorities and how do we balance accessible prices with sustainable values?
I suppose it depends on how many books you're making as well. I tend to make between 500 and 2,000 books. So it's all relative. But one of the things that I think everyone can do is as Rebecca briefly touched on, is optimize the book size for the paper that you're printing on. For example, Gomer Printing here in the UK, on their website, they have information about their press and what page sizes are optimal for printing on the B1 paper size. So that's one of the first things, I think, to keep prices down, and also use papers that your printer may have in stock, recycled papers or papers that they don't have to have shipped in from a long way off, because that adds a lot of expense as well. And maintain tight quality control, which I mentioned earlier, is just make sure that you've got the best budget for the best quality books, so that you're not wasting money on losses of actual copies of your books. That's pretty much what I have to say for a start.
Okay, is this something that, I mean, I'm interested to hear how the rest of you, Martin particularly, because I know that you face slightly different challenges being in South America, outside of the sort of incredible amount of traffic of goods and materials that passes back between, say, North America, the UK, and Europe. This relates slightly to one of the other questions, the question of distance and the mitigating factors it introduces. But how do you balance those choices with that kind of third term?
Yeah, I think actually in these terms is one of the biggest challenges to being able to translate like the price cost decision of going in a sustainable way. It's very, very, very hard for the consumers here to accept that change in price or that more cost. So it's a bit difficult in commercial senses for producing this type of books and being able to distribute them. On the other hand, we do not have that big market so as to produce like 2,000 books, as Tiffany said. So most of the books can be made in smaller production systems, which in a sense are quite better. But I think that the challenge is actually an economical challenge in a way. I think in my sense, we are in Argentina, which is, as everyone knows, quite far away from some of the places where diverse papers are produced. I myself in the publishing house work with 2 types of paper, which are locally produced in Argentina. And even if I wanted to use like international paper, the cost is almost impossible to translate to a book. So it's kind of a dilemma, non-dilemma solved by the distance in a way, you know. It's a problem that we do not have, but we do not have because we cannot have it in a way, because we have the papers that we have, and even if we tried to use like international papers, it's super expensive to make books here in that sense. So kind of the problems brings the solution, which is using local paper.
Yeah. And I think something that you touched on that we don't always think about as well is how enfranchised our consumer base is.
Yeah.
Because I think you're the only person in the room who has experience of a photo book fair circuit outside of the sort of European one. You know, any one of us who's been to Paris Photo knows that so much money is changing hands, and there are a lot of people there with a lot of money to spend. And I suspect that's somewhat different where you are.
Yeah, that's why I was addressing this difficulty in translating the price of some decisions that are going to make the book more expensive, and the market is already very limited. So it's quite a dilemma to take on these decisions, you know, because like thinking about using a sustainable paper in a way, it means that you're not going to sell the book. Point. You know, so it's, again, I'm listening to all the problematics that you bring and you talk, and most of them are translatable to this part of the world, and others are not in a way. No? Like it's a bit different. It's a bit smaller. Everything in a way, which again it brings its own problems and its own advantages.
Yeah. And Maren, was this something that you'd sort of looked into as part of your explorations into hemp? How does that change the economics of the whole thing potentially?
With all the wonderful claims I make about hemp, the pricing on paper is certainly not one of them, unfortunately, I have to say. In fact, this was one of the biggest problems of the book. The very exclusively produced paper ended up in such a high price, which, you know, is part of the research which even is covered in that tree-free chapter in the book, which was the supply chain issues. So there's only one pulping company that sits in Spain. So we have material being transported from the Netherlands and from France, where the quantity of hemp is being grown at the current moment. That is being transported down to Spain. There the pulp is being made, and from there it's actually being distributed worldwide, which there's an absolute monopoly on the pulping of the hemp material. And, you know, one of the things that happened through the book, because it's been such a long and intricate research, is that I'm now also involved in a lot of these sort of, you know, supply chain issues solving. So we're actually trying to set up a system where we have smaller pulping factories distributed all over Europe, which are very close to the main areas that are producing hemp, which that potentially could really solve the problem. But of course, we're looking into something that's way ahead the road. So at the very moment, this paper is about 4 times more expensive than some of the most expensive papers for photo book printing, which, you know, we have to be absolutely horrendously honest. This is something that most artists will not be able to accept, or won't even be able to really integrate into their practice. And I just had a call with somebody who's actually doing paper pulp today, and he said, snickering, well, you know, if you need to make a decision between sustainable and non-sustainable, go digital. And this is actually what we're doing right now. We're making an ebook version of the H's for Hemp, which of course for an artist is sort of a drawback, because you do want to have that haptic experience of a book. But it was, you know, here I got caught in between this wanting to make a proof of concept that yes, you can make hemp paper, but, and there's this big but, that the price ended up being something that is definitely a huge embargo on any artistic project. And for the moment, with the supply chains as they are, it's also not necessarily the most sustainable option. The paper in itself, yes, but not the way it's set up with all this carrying raw materials all over Europe.
I was wondering, actually, as you said that, if you'd had a conversation with Rebecca about calculating, you know, the footprint of that hidden kind of the way that infrastructure can limit.
I'm sure we will have further conversations after this, because this is certainly something that concerns me very much. There's also been a question from Mahala. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. And that's also concerning the footprint of all my travel. And I think it's awesome that you asked that. If I may just address this question really quick, because it kind of fits in here. I actually decided to live in my car for 4 years, which was probably slightly insane. I never intended to do that for 4 years. It was just a thing that I moved into my car in order to start my research. And then I realized, oh la la, this is a lot of traveling I'm doing. And the only way I can sort of compensate for this extreme traveling I'm doing is by not going back and forth, which would have doubled every kilometer by twice. So I actually ended up sort of, giving myself these parameters of just traveling in one direction. And I don't mean that very literal. I mean, I was going all over the place, but I wouldn't go back and forth. I would always try to really basically make a roadmap of everyone I wanted to research, and then see that I would, traveling 2,000 kilometers to Spain would basically result in like a 200-kilometer increment of travels, because I had stations to stop and research at. And actually living in the car also, I would say, obviously I left my footprint with driving the car, but then at the same time I was living in it. So I was, no electricity, no infrastructure, as far as no sanitary infrastructure. So I had an extremely minimal lifestyle, which probably compensated for some of the footprint that I created. The far travels I did, for example, I traveled by train to Mongolia, which was, of course, a lot of time I had to invest, but at least I was able to take the train. So I tried to make conscious decisions as they were available to me, which doesn't mean I never went in an airplane. I definitely did. And I do not want to say that this was, by any chance green travel or anything, but I still, up to today, try to really not go on planes if there's any chance that I can reach a place by land, or just simply not go, which obviously COVID-19 brought some new opportunities there, because people became much more susceptible to online conversations or online events.
I think this leads really nicely into the second question, which is, can making a book ever really be sustainable? And Maren, you raised a really interesting point. You said you're making an ebook, which for many of us, like you said, is like the horrible scenario. And Rebecca, I wondered if you could speak to this. We think of digital as environmentally sustainable because, of course, it doesn't involve paper, it doesn't involve shipping things back and forth, but there's another aspect, obviously, of digital media and our digital environment more generally that is highly unsustainable, and of course that's these massive server farms, isn't it? I wondered if you'd had a chance to look at the footprint of those sort of things, Rebecca, and if you look at the kind of footprint of ebooks.
So in terms of it's still an area of research that I'm personally very interested in and nerding out in my free time, but it's very much an innovative space where we are not 100% sure. What I would say is, in terms of data center, it really depends on the country where it's hosted, and where you are using the energy coming from. And I think there's a very cool website, I don't know if you've seen it, called Electricity Maps. That's just a nice way to look at I'm sorry, I've lost you at the same time here. That is always interesting to see. And you can usually try and, but that would be for online. I think ebook is a downloadable thing that you have saved as a PDF. So then the real question that is still a very obscure area is, what is a material embodied carbon in your ebook reader, in your laptops, and how many use do you use that? You know, if you have a carbon footprint of 150 kilos for your MacBook, how many times do you need to use your MacBook to read to make that the same as a book? And I think in terms of all the heavy and rare earth metal and lithium that is in your Mac, you know, I personally think that someone who uses an iPhone 8 or 7 is sexy, and having the latest iPhone is not very sexy. So it's work in progress. It's a very obscure place that information is quite hard to get. But I'm keeping it, I'm doing it on my free time. So maybe in 2 years, it'll become a lot more public knowledge. I'm looking for it. No one knows at the moment. No one knows.
If I can add a tiny bit to that, since Eugenie, you mentioned it, I'm living off-grid right now, so I'm actually, you know, getting all my energy from the solar plates that I have up here. And it was actually up here on the cabin that I realized how heavy my footprint is when it comes down to running off external hard drives to keep my computer running all day. And, you know, just also, you know, I had running everything off my mobile data, and I had 80 gigabytes on my phone plan until I started living up here for several months. And then I had to change that because I couldn't get through a month with 80 gigabytes of mobile data, just because of phone, you know, Zoom conferences and everything. And so it's, I mean, sometimes you really have to go far to do these self-experimentations to realize where we create, where we create these footprints. And it's really interesting also when you have sort of a way of the hard way to measure it, which is when you get cut off because you realize, okay, my battery is not big enough to support a full month of working, you know, every day, 8 hours being plugged into the wall.
So this is kind of, again, moving into the next question really quite neatly. And this was a question that came from a lot of potential book makers, people who wanted to make books, who were thinking about, you know, how do I find sustainable options? How do I research them? Where do I start? And Tiffany, I wondered if we could sort of circle back to you to get started with this question. And then maybe to Martin. Martin's spoken a little bit about it already, such as, you know, your choices are very limited by the geography. But Tiffany, you're working in a market where your choices are really quite large, relatively speaking. So where do you begin when you're researching sustainable options?
Hi, I'm here. Thanks for the question. Yes. Well, I definitely have a library of samples that I return to over and over again. And so I often use papers that I've used before, that I know how well they reproduce images and the quality of, you know, the longevity of the paper, the feel of the paper. And so I think, you know, it's good to build yourself a resource list and use that to make your decisions usually. And I do regular research and just feel as many books as I can to feel what, it's all about feel for me. So that's the most important thing. And recycled papers are great for that. Does that pretty much cover?
Well, I don't think there's any one single answer. I wondered if the rest of you had queries, like if you know, someone who's new to making a book came up to you and said, well, how do I find sustainable options? Where do I start? What would you say to them?
Well, there's definitely a few mills that do recycled paper as a specialty, or they use some kind of like recycled waste in their making. But Munkin papers are very commonly used in photography books. So that's the Munkin mill. You can order like paper samples from them. There's also Arjo Wiggins, which does recycled papers. I think they even have a website, recycledpapers.com. I think that's it, but it's Arjo Wiggins. And they have quite a few different types of recycled papers that are great for printing photography. Otherwise, I think there's specialty sort of paper dealers all over the world. Here we have GF Smith, where you can do research into their catalog of papers. You can get a sample book from them to see all the different colors and paper types that they have. So yeah, just starting with those kinds of options, and you can start branching out to see once you learn more about them, you can or about how papers are made, you can branch out and find what other people are using and use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any?
Yeah, I may have a piece of advice for novel authors and people that are starting to produce books. I think one of the biggest problems in book productions is not having a clear idea of your distribution capacities. No, so if you are doing the first book, maybe you go and print 500, 1,000 books, and then you sell 80 books, 100, 200. And then you have like stored for 10 years, 500 extra books, which is a problem that actually happens a lot for people that don't have experience in printing, because they all go straight to offset. And I think that it's actually maybe a more soft experience to begin printing in smaller batches and like test the capacities of distribution of pieces that you make. So maybe if you're beginning with publishing house, maybe start with one book, 200 copies, digital printing, see how that goes. Next book, 200-300, next 400. Don't start like with straight offset. I mean, I think it's a common image, no, of people that have this super enthusiasm for having their first book being printed. And everyone is, wow, super. And you all then have like boxes in back with half of the production that hasn't been sold. And yeah, I think that can be balanced with using another printing, another production system.
So taking into account not being, let's say, a little bit too optimistic about how much you might sell, because of course waste, books that don't get sold and that end up having to be pulped, or that some, and I understand that some can't be pulped. If you've used coated paper, that can't be recycled because it's really difficult to get the ink off the paper. So yeah, I mean, what's really interesting at this point is the number of kind of hidden things, the infrastructure of hemp processing, where data centers are hosted, the invisible waste that we generate when we don't sell our books. All of those things are really fascinating, and things that I don't think the new bookmaker would necessarily think of. There was a question that I wanted to pose to all of you, and it's been one that's been raised a number of times in discussions I've been part of, and that's the question of distributed printing. Where, for instance, you would send a file, you would create a file that could be sent digitally to another part of the world and printed there. So you would be offsetting the waste associated with printing locally and then sending elsewhere with, I guess what you could say, the loss of kind of creative control, if you want to call it that, associated with basically sending someone a file and saying, make my book. I wonder if that's something any of you have had any experience of, because it raises a lot of interesting questions as artists in relation to the amount of creative control we expect to have over our books. I'm always getting Instagram photos of people who are on press with such and such a publisher. It's a really exciting thing. It's a really exciting part of the process. And to not have that anymore, I think some people might find quite strange.
I might like to try and give an answer to this. This was one of the processes we were trying with H's for Hemp. So with Hanemühle together, we had a printer that was probably a very unlikely printer for the term of printing an art book. because they're doing mainly the digital inkjet printing, and I didn't really get that at the very beginning. And then you know, as we were starting to talk through the process on where we could save, you know, on paper by doing roll paper and then doing it inkjet printed, we decided to only do the indigo inkjet printing on the cover sheet because that's a little bit more durable. But then again, that in the recycling process would be fatal because you cannot recycle it. It's basically toxic waste. And we were trying to set it up in a way where the Lardeur printing house, they have a couple of sister printing houses, one in Scandinavia, one in the United States. And the original idea was actually to do exactly that, to take the PDF file and then send it over to the United States and then have the book, you know, for the US demand produced in the US, which in fact, it didn't work out, which was unfortunately all part of, you know, war breaking out just in the same moment as I was publishing the book. And there were so many issues with, you know, just regular mailing books from A to B. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that as well, who were in the, especially the publishing world. But we're still kind of flirting with the idea, but I also had to realize that it was really, really difficult because a lot of the printing houses do not want to take on that challenge of basically producing an artwork without the artist being present and kind of vouchering for it, signing it off by the page and saying, okay, this is going to be good. Plus you have, as an artist, as you said, Eugenie, you have zero input, zero, you can't influence the process. You do not even know what's going to be shipped out to your clients. So it is a little bit of a new approach to bookmaking, but I think eventually we will probably have to learn to take cutbacks, if that's the right word. I'm not quite sure. We have to let that losing control process happen in order to go more sustainable routes. Otherwise, it will not be possible. If I would have driven to the printing site to oversee the printing process, it would have been another 500 kilometers. We chose to have a glue binding back instead of the open stitched Swiss brochure binding, because that would have demanded the book to be, everything printed, and then it would have been shipped somewhere else to be stitch bound. Then it would have gone back to the original printer's place to have the cover put on it. So we decided, nope, the glue binding is something that the printer can already do in-house because they have the facility ready for that. So this is what we're going to do. So there were a lot of changes on the actual format of the book that were absolutely directed by what is the least impactful way to produce this book. And by no means would that make a, really low carbon footprint book.
I mean, for me, this was one of the most interesting questions, this question of changing our headspace as artists in a way. Because when we think about moving towards a more sustainable future, we have to think about compromises. What car can I reasonably drive that isn't going to pollute, that isn't going to cause traffic jams on the roads, that isn't going to start to destroy infrastructure because of its excessive size. And it's balancing needs with desires. And as artists, everything we do is in a way based on desire in some way or another. I found that a really, really fascinating question. I just wondered if any of you had anything to say about that or anything to add.
Yeah, I had something to add to the previous question. It's possible. I was thinking you stated this alternative of maybe producing like batches of books in different printers like around the world instead of sending books. And I think there's also like a complement alternative in that front, which is something that I'm trying to do in the publishing house, sometimes with worse or better success, but I'm trying. That is that most of my books have like an open source printing format published online. I mean, you can come to Buenos Aires, you can go to a fair in Latin America and buy my books, but also you can download the printing file and you can print it like at your home or a local printer or digital printer, like accept the limits in a way, and also I think that part of the, or at least part of this commitment that you said begins with being generous, you know, like, and I mean, I know this is not like a complete solution for the book process, but I think this opens a bit the gap, like going straight from publishing house to reader with no printer in between. You know what I mean? Like you can print your own book if you want. I think this can also be explored as a commercial model in a way. Like, I know the book is $30, but you can download your file for $3 and make it yourself. Like, I know, alternatives.
Yeah.
But I think there's something around there that can be explored a lot more than it is.
It's also, sorry, was someone else?
I would like to actually ask a question to Martin. Martin,
Yeah.
how do you do the copyright issue if you're uploading a PDF to your website that people can download? Because this is definitely one of the things I've seen. Mathieu Asselin, for example, with his Monsanto book, he had the PDF up for a while that you could download for free. It just, I think as a photographer, it's really, really difficult. Like, do you give your work away for free, or how do you have any ways of protecting that, or?
I mean, I don't have the answer. I think that there are not ways of protecting your rights, but again, I think it's the question is the same. No, what are you willing to give towards the things that you ask in a way? No. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that no one's gonna like download your book and make a super production of it and sell it. I don't think that actually happens. No, in a way, I think that the worst that can happen is a guy in a university prints 10 of your books to sell them for paying college, which could be something amazing. But yeah, I'm not sure about the answer. I don't know.
I mean, it raises some really interesting questions about the way we design books. You know, if you're designing a book, if you're from the very beginning, you're thinking about the book design as something that's going to be co-created by a complete stranger printing it in a location that you don't know. You know, taking that as a possibility from the start could lead to some really interesting design choices. I know we wanted to leave some time for questions from the audience, and I'm seeing quite a lot in the chat. So I just wanted to, just one final question for everybody, just before we open it up to the audience. There's a publisher, an imprint in America called Neck Press. And I saw on their Instagram feed a few months back, somebody who had grown mushrooms in one of their books. They'd used it as a mushroom farm, and they're always putting photos on their Instagram feed of their books being destroyed or their books sitting on a compost heap. And listening to you guys talking, I'm thinking, well, do we want to make our books to last, or do we want to make them to disappear?
I wouldn't mind answering some of that.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely think that all the books that I make are made to last, but to be used with care as well. But I think also there's a design sensibility that I like where, you know, once you actually start using a book, it becomes far more sort of personalized or more, there's a more nostalgic feel to it. And you could still pass it on. And some of the books that I've made are actually quite fragile in a way, but they can be rebuilt, like hand sewing, that can be redone, like just a center stitched hand bound book. Anybody can fix it. So I kind of like the idea of imagining a book can fall apart and still last for forever or for as long as possible, but also that it just brings something more to the book if there's a delicacy to it.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily need to last forever, but I think that there's a lifetime that they should live. Otherwise, why bother making one? I mean, that's how I feel.
Yeah.
But you can also, you know, imagine like one of the books that I made, I can imagine it like the papers and materials used that it could just end up buried underground and disappear. And that's quite exciting to imagine.
Yeah. Okay. I'm wondering if now would be a good time to hand back to Tamsin because you've been keeping track of the questions in the chat, haven't you? And I wondered if you wanted to take over sort of moderating the questions at this point, because you've been watching them as they come in.
Sure, I can do that. Thank you everyone for your presentations and all of the amazing discussion so far. There's a couple of questions that have come through. The first one is about somebody is saying that they were recommended to use offset papers on an inkjet printer. And this was for making their own handmade books, and whether that is a sustainable approach to materials. I wonder if anyone could answer that one. So as I understand it, papers that are used on if you want to use papers on a digital machine that are made for offset, they need a special sapphire coating in order to use them on another printer. I don't know if anyone knows about inkjet specific.
I'll just say that I think offset paper is essentially standard paper, and it should go through your inkjet printer, no problem. I don't know, you know, how balanced you want to be with the sustainability of the ink that you use in your inkjet printer. That's up to you, but there's certainly like a vast selection of offset papers. They usually come in quite a large size, so in millimeters, 700 by 1000 is common here. So you'd obviously have to cut it down to use in a home inkjet printer. Hopefully that gives some answer.
I just add that it depends on your context and where you are and what is available. If you need to source offset paper from another country, you might as well get the inkjet paper you have down your roads. So context, be mindful of context.
Yeah, I think that we can all agree that most sustainable paper is the paper that is produced nearest to you in a way. No? I think that I'm not sure about the carbon footprint, but I think it's almost for sure that buying the local paper produced is going to win paper that comes with boat or the airplane or whatever. No, I think.
Yeah, I think it's like the end of my presentation is about that balancing priorities and balancing what is there. I think if you have everything around you, I'd always promote recycled content paper, so you remove pressure from new sources. But it depends on the printer you have. If you have an inkjet and you have offset, use that. If you have an offset printer, don't go to another city to print, would be my advice.
Yeah, I think from my side, I can only add that, you know, understanding these supply chain issues is sort of like you check off your pyramid of things. You know, if you have local inks being produced, then you need to look at them in terms of recyclability and how toxic they are. Are they soluble? I think all of these points have been touched before. With the papers, it's one of these things, you know, if you live in, I think Munken paper is, I think, on the west coast of Sweden, if I'm not mistaken, you know, if you live close to them, then that's a wonderful resource to use. If you have to ship the Munken paper from Sweden all over the place because they don't already have a set up distribution, then it might be a very sustainable paper, but it might not be your sustainable paper because it's first had to travel around the world. Maybe I also want to mention, I don't think we've touched on that, the FSC labels. You know, these are labels that I really recommend everybody to at least be aware that they're not really what they're promising to be, because the FSC is, especially in the Scandinavian model, there's nobody to judge. So the FSC says that you can't do any clear cutting, but usually the clear cuts are done by private owners of forests and not by the governmental forests or by the big forest companies that have to abide by these rules. Which means if a private forest owner just cuts down all of their forests, they do still get the FSC label because there's no judge around to really say, hey, what you did was wrong and you didn't wait for the forest scientists to make their evaluation before you cut down your entire forest. So it's really, I think it's very difficult to answer these sustainability questions sort of on a global, holistic scale. And this is, I think, where we have to really understand that in order to achieve sustainability in any case, we have to do the zoom in and zoom out. We have to understand our global problems and then zoom into each geography and understand what's going on there. Martin, you being from Argentina, you know, you guys have a lot of the tropical, you know, forests. I mean, obviously you have a huge variety of geography, but there is some in the south that might be bordering to that as well. So this is something you want to take into account, while we have to look more to basically debunk these claims of sustainability when it comes down to FSC labels, which a lot of companies just rely on blindly. They should know better.
Thank you. I think exactly on this point of there not being a kind of one size fits all is exactly where these case study features, the idea for these came from in the first place with the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network, because through the discussions that we started to have as part of the network, we realized that it wasn't as simple as just producing a checklist that everybody could follow, but wherever you were and whatever type of book you were making and however many you were making and what the purpose was of that book, you would come up with a different set of decisions based on the same set of maybe questions. But the thought process you would go through and the availability of those options would guide you in a different direction for each book, which isn't the answer that most people want, because everyone would like a simple checklist of how to do things. But it's so important to think on an individual book basis, I think. So Jin is asking about the cost of books versus the cost of sustainable options. And I think she's asking, is there a case for higher priced books? I think this is something that we've touched on. Maren, you touched on it with the price of the production of your hemp paper and how that pushed up the price of the books through going down that route. And I think also, Martin, maybe you touched on this with balancing the affordability of books and the options that are available to you in terms of options. But I wonder, does anyone else have anything else to contribute to that question?
I can add something if it's possible. That I think that there's again this dilemma, because in bookmaking, if you want to lower the cost, the first solution is to rise the quantity of books that you make, because the individual cost of each book is going to lower, right? So for you to make a more competitive book using sustainable materials, the first solution is to make more. But if you make more, then you have the problem that you have a lot of books. So I think, again, it's a matter of like individual study of each case. Understanding that it's not a general solution, but that moving one thing upwards makes the other go, you know what I mean? That's the kind of dilemmas that at least I'm trapped on right now.
Can I add something here? All I'll add is how important it is to define what sustainability is to you, and how you define it and what your ambitions are, because then that allows you to make decisions. And I think that's what we were trying to do by having our methods and our things. But even then, it's hard to make decisions. So if you decide what it means for you, if you think that biodiversity means more for you, or if it's social justice means more for you, so as all the decisions become easier. And sustainability is a big word that means many things. So
Actually, I'd have one thing to add, Tamsin. I learned that from you, and it was something that truly inspired me when I met you first time in real life at the Paris Photo. You know, the idea of ownership on books. Obviously, the art books are a bit more higher priced, and I think, you know, keeping editions low so you don't have to actually destroy any books after all because they're not being sold. And opening this world of actually, how do you say, lending out or borrowing out? I keep switching these two words. Those who are native English speakers, please help me, Tamsin. It's
Library.
borrowing. Yeah, like the library concept.
Yeah.
And you told me that you're doing that with your books that actually were on a very low run and of you know, publishing run, and then when they ran out, that you're starting to keep one and then kind of passing that around. I think that really adds some real beautiful value to a book, and I think this should be maybe integrated into our future sustainable concepts.
Yeah. We have somebody on the call now who's currently got one of my books on loan, which is nice. So, yeah. There's one more question which I can find in the chat, which is Leslie is saying that she loved the idea of printing in different locations, but wondered whether with that model, how far you would specify the types of inks and papers. And I think she's asking about that in a more, rather than quality control, in a sustainable angle of how would you ensure that those are sustainable choices in different locations. I wonder if anyone wants to answer that.
Well, I'll have a try at it, and obviously this is not a full answer, but you know, trying to produce the H's for Hemp book on different continents, because there was such an international community that was interested in getting the book, I realized that, you know, it's very, very difficult because you have to be a super expert, like a super niche expert in literally every single continent that's out there in order to know which are the most sustainable printing inks that you can get your hands on, which are the sustainable papers that are available on location. So I think we probably have to open our thoughts much more into collaborative efforts and really cooperating with each other, such as we're doing tonight, because it's really, there's an expert in each country, or you know, in a specific region that will know things. I'm sure, Tiffany, you'd probably have a ton of suggestions on papers for me that I'm not even aware of, and I've been researching paper for years now. So I think collaboration is a real big issue, and you know, this is one of the beauties that's coming out of all this globalism that's also causing us so many problems. So I think we should certainly try to distill out or filter out the positive things that come from this.
Absolutely.
Yes, I think those are all the questions which have so far gone into the chat. If anyone has any final burning questions, if you want to share them now.
I'm not sure. I think I spotted one from Antonina about paper and color reproduction on uncoated papers.
Yeah, there's more about the balance between color reproduction in photos and using recycled uncoated papers. Are there particular papers that perform particularly well for that, or is it the case of letting it go a bit?
Maybe I can answer a bit about that since I've been on about paper. I think that that there's a huge difference between coated and uncoated paper, and probably in most instances the uncoated paper would be more sustainable, and it depends on what kinds of inks you can use on that. And there's people here who can give more information about inks, but with uncoated papers, the ink tends to absorb a bit more into the fibers, and so you might get a more sort of dull reproduction than you would get on a coated paper. And so on a coated paper, the ink sits right on the surface, whereas on uncoated paper, it seeps into the fibers. That's just a basic kind of explanation that hopefully helps.
I can add one thing from the hemp paper making experience. Our first technical dummy, when we printed that, it actually even created creases in the paper because the black inks were absorbed so heavily that it literally, it was like a wet rag that started, folding up on the press. So this is obviously what you don't want. And one of the things I learned from that experience is that there's a lot of the fine tuning that has to be done from the paper mill or paper manufacturer in that case by, boiling the pulp more or less and adding more or less of the binders. And I think, the uncoated papers will probably be the way of the future if we want to be more sustainable, because that's actually an easy one to get. But at the same time, we will have to fine tune or hone in the skills of the paper makers to understand that the standard formulas, and I mean, they actually work with recipes. Hanemühle, which is a company that started in 1570 something. So they have a long history in the paper making. And I saw some of these old recipe books, and it's really interesting to see that this is like a cooking experience. They go through the books and then they see how was the paper made, how is the water quality. So there's a lot of these outer factors that go into the actual high quality of the final paper. And I think these things can be compensated because this was one of the main issues we had to resolve until printing the final book. I think it just needs a bit more attention, because so far with the coating, these things are not completely irrelevant, but they are much more relevant than with uncoated papers.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to time because we said we were going to try and finish by 8 o'clock and it's 8:01. So I'd just like to say thank you to everyone so much for participating this evening. Thank you to the panel for being a part of it. Thank you to Eugenie for doing such a brilliant job of moderating the discussion. And thank you to everybody for joining this evening and asking questions. And yeah, if you want any more information about the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network, I'll also pop that link, as I realised I didn't, in the chat.
Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you, everyone that's participated today in the panel, and for all of your questions from the audience as well. It's been an incredible talk and great to hear from you. So yeah, thank you from Format. Thank you, Neve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.